invite Sophie Blackall, who's going to be speaking with us about memories and how they influence her stories with us today.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your patience. I just actually created that entire technical glitch to give you long enough to forget how amazing those young people were, so I wouldn't have to follow them so swiftly. They were fantastic, more articulate than they deserve to be. Thank you for having me to this amazing festival. It has been quite a couple of days. I am honored to be here to talk to you about books. So many fellow authors and illustrators and educators in the room. Mostly I'm going to be talking about this book called Farmhouse, but I have done a bunch of books that I have written and illustrated other people's books. And I would like to talk a tiny bit about why I make books for children. First and foremost, I think about the reader. I love the people who read my books. I love engaging with children. I think about children all the time when I am making books. And I've learned this is not always the case. There are some authors and illustrators who make books for the child they once were, or they make books and then other people say they're for children. But some of us are very much engaged with the children for whom we make the books. And I think about the different kinds of readers. There are the kinds of readers who take a book to bed with them. And I love this kind of reader who takes not only their book, but their art supplies to bed. This is a reader after my own heart. There is the kind of kid who has some kind of enormous challenge and who is maybe undergoing something that is difficult to imagine for any of us, and they have a book to take with them that is a comfort, and I love that kind of reader. I love the kinds of readers who are given a book and who can't wait to get home to read it. They have to drop to the ground right then and there with their backpack and cluster around and read that book. And I love the kind of reader like these kids in Rwanda who had never before held a book in their hands. These were their first books, and they were written in their local language, and they had pictures and a story, and they were turning the pages and reading for the very first time. Up until now, they had read rote sentences and individual words written on the chalkboard, which they would repeat over and over again. And now they were reading a story. So I think very hard about the readers of my books, and I think what will make them want to pick up a book in the first place. Because we have this opportunity to make a book, it is a physical object. I've been talking today about all of you people who love books for the objects that they are. You don't have to plug them in. They don't run out of power. You can share them with other people. They are relatively inexpensive, and they will last a lot longer than most of the technology that we have. So what can we do with this physical book? First of all, it's the cover. And if you're lucky enough to work with a publisher who will do what we call bells and whistles, they will do fancy things like embossing and spot gloss that makes it look like there are windows in the farmhouse that you might be able to see through. We think about the front cover and the back cover, and then what is underneath the jacket when you take it off. And sometimes we get to do something surprising underneath the jacket, like in the case of Farmhouse, where we look inside the house. Because kid readers are curious, and they're going to take that jacket off as soon as they get the book home. Then, of course, ultimately, the most important thing for a child reading a book is the story. Some stories begin and follow a linear path to their end. Some have hazards along the way, and there's backwards and forwards, and you're not sure if you're going to make it. And some stories have so many twists and turns, you don't know if you're going to get to the end at all. But most good stories have a beginning and a middle and an end. And I have learned that children often really respond to the kinds of stories that have a beginning and a middle and an end that leads you back to the beginning again in some way or another. I often put something that is like a bookend in my book, something that happens in the beginning that we then echo in the end of the book. So in Farmhouse, which I will actually, if you will indulge me, read to you later, there is a beginning scene where they are posing for a photograph on the hall in their house. And at the end, after most of the story, we return to that hallway, and the photograph of the children shows what they all became when they grew up. And there's the little space on the faded wallpaper of where the picture once hung. I love to try to make a book that a kid will want to read again and again and again. And I've spoken to parents and educators who are worried about this. They say, my kid wants to read the same book again and again and again, and I keep wanting to steer them in different directions. However, here is my argument for reading a book again and again and again. Children do not have very much power. They do not have much agency in their lives. They are mostly told where they are going to go and at what time and how they are going to do the next things that they do in their lives. But with a book, they know how that book is going to end. They can return to that book and have the safe knowledge of where that story is going to go. And there is enormous comfort in that for a kid who maybe doesn't know what else is going to happen. They know that thing. And to return to something that we know as adults, we often, I certainly do, reread books that I know and love. There is also academic research to show that a child who reads 4 books 5 times each will retain far more vocabulary words than a kid who reads 20 individual books. So there is your academic argument for rereading books. And as a bookmaker, I love it when a parent says to me with something of a grimace, "Oh, we've read your book 1,000,000 times." And I say, sorry, not sorry, because it always makes me very happy. So, the next thing that is most important to me, we've given a kid a cover that is a book that they want to pick it up. How do we get them to keep reading this book? How do we get them to turn the page, which is what reading is all about, right? It is how are they going to turn that page to keep reading that book and then read another book and another book and another book. So this is where I get into the weeds as an illustrator. I'm going to show you a few spreads of different books of how I have tried to create a page turn that will make a child want to keep reading. In Hello Lighthouse, in which the illustrations all take place either inside the lighthouse or outside the lighthouse. Inside the lighthouse, the family story takes place in circles, and as the pages go along, the circles get bigger and bigger in the spread until we get to the woman in labor. It says, inside the lighthouse, the woman walks around and around the room. Her husband boils water and helps her breathe in and out. He tends the light and writes in the logbook. And I always say to kids, what's going to happen next? And they know what's going to happen next. Also, by the way, boiling water for husbands is just to keep them busy. There's no real need for them to boil water. It's just while the woman is doing the work, give the man a job to do. And notes the birth of their child. And then there are no more circles except on the quilt and the rug, because the birth of a child takes up the whole world. Here's another one. Beyond the breakers, they all look up. Goodbye, lighthouse. Goodbye, goodbye, goodbye. So they are leaving. The boat is going. You want to turn the page. Is this the end? What's going to happen? On the highest rock of a tiny island at the edge of the world stands a lighthouse. It is built to last forever, sending its light out to sea. The fog rolls in and the fog rolls out. The waves rise and crash. The wind blows and blows. Hello, hello, hello. And we see that they are not actually going that far after all. They're just going to land. In the book, If You Come to Earth, which I shared with 4th graders today, which was a joyful experience, it is about everything in the world. We come to the spread, "The sea looks empty," and kids will notice this boat and this little pointy thing on the horizon, which is maybe an island, but actually it's full. In "If I Was a Horse," "If I was a horse, I bet my brother wouldn't even believe it." We read from left to right, and we see a window with rain coming down outside, which leads us into the next page. "If it was raining, I wouldn't care. I would roll in the mud and laugh and laugh. Nobody could make me take a bath." I have had a number of emails from parents who say their children no longer want to take a bath after reading this book, and I feel only mildly responsible. In Finding Winnie, the true story of the world's most famous bear, at the beginning of the book, the Captain Colborne, who is a soldier, is leaving for World War I, and we see this very familiar scene that we know from photographs and stories of soldiers leaving and being sent off with a farewell at the train station. The train then goes off to the edge of the page, and we turn that page and we see the train go through time and through these panels and through a tunnel and arrives at the next station. That arc of the train leading you through the story, making you want to turn the page, is echoed later on in the book when we see the soldiers marching in the same formation. And that first scene where everybody is saying goodbye to their loved ones at the station. At the end of the book, we see their return, and it mirrors the composition exactly, but children will notice the difference because this is after the war. So it was a way of addressing the atrocities and the horror of World War I in a slightly more subtle way that rewards the reader, the repeat reader. This is me as a kid. When I was a kid, I loved to read. I was lucky enough to have access to books. My mother always made sure we had a library card. There was a mobile library in the village where I grew up in South Australia, which was a tiny van, and I read every book that ever came in that van in the children's section, and then I read the grown-up books. And one of my favorite books was The Little House. Is anyone familiar with this book, Virginia Lee Burton? And in this book, it's an anthropomorphized story of a little house that is built in the country, surrounded by rolling hills. And bit by bit, progress comes, and the city is built up around the house, who is then crowded in. And I empathized with this house as a child. I loved this house. And so I think it was very much in the back of my mind when I bought my own farmhouse in the rolling hills of upstate New York, over a hill at the end of a road, by a glittering stream that twists and turns. And I bought a farm that we would turn into Milkwood, and some of you have heard us talking about Milkwood, which is a creative retreat in the Catskill Mountains of New York State for the children's book community all over the world who come and visit us there. But on this property, there was also a falling down house. It was hidden under vines and weeds and overgrown trees. And this was the first time I went inside. Oops, oh, that was a video, but it didn't work. Maybe the videos are not going to work. That's interesting. Ed is just seeing whether there's anything. And it's not the end of the world, but no, No, never mind. You all have imaginations. So Farmhouse was made with the contents I found in the falling down house. There was wallpaper, there were old books. And the story did not come to me rapidly. I knew that I wanted to make a book about this house where 12 children had been born and raised. I knew that I wanted to use the contents that I found in the house. There were 21 hand-sewn dresses. There was old wallpaper. There were the children's school books. But I didn't know how I was going to write this story. And one day, I was driving to a book festival in Virginia, and it was a 5-hour drive, and my car started making a terrible rattling sound, and I called the mechanic, and he said, "If you can get here by 5 o'clock, I will fit you in." It was 12 o'clock on the dot, so I could not stop driving. And I had told myself, I will use this time to write this story because it's been very long and my editor is getting anxious. So I drove, and I got the first line of the book. It came into my head: "Over a hill at the end of the road by a glittering stream that twists and turns stands a house." And I thought, oh, thank goodness, it's been months and months and I haven't been able to find this story, and now I have it, and I can't write it down because I am driving and I cannot stop. So I said it over and over and over again to myself. And then I got the next line: "Over a hill at the end of the road by a glittering stream that twists and turns stands a house where 12 children were born and raised." And then I kept adding on and saying it over and over and over again until 5 hours later I had written this story, and it was all one sentence. And I got to the mechanic and I threw him the keys. It was 4:59, and I spoke the whole long sentence into my phone and sent it to my editor, and she called me weeping, "Thank God." I didn't realize how worried she had been. So this book is one sentence: "Where 12 children were born and raised, where they learned to crawl in the short front hall, where they posed arranged on the wooden stairs and were measured with marks over the years. Where they carved potatoes and dipped them in paint to pattern the walls with flowers and leaves and painted the cat about which they lied. For which they were scolded, and maybe they cried, and were then enfolded in forgiving arms in the serious room where the organ was played and speeches were made. But if they weren't even sorry at all, they were sent to their rooms where they pored over books about planets and stars, then climbed into bed where they dreamed of Mars, or they dreamed of cats or the distant sea. And whispered secrets, played truth or dare, and lost their teeth and brushed their hair, where they kept collections of tin toy cars and feathers and bones and movie stars, where they hung prize ribbons for champion cows that lived in the barn behind the house and were milked twice a day, no matter the weather, at dawn and at dusk, by one child or another, who shivered and grumbled as they crossed the yard, or liked being alone with a flaming cloud, depending on the season or the day or the child. And so it goes on through various times and seasons, and the dripping hole, the hole in the roof. The children who all grew up in this house, who went off to school or to work on a farm or to drive a truck or train as a nurse or study the stars or have babies themselves, until one day the youngest child, who was now quite old, took a last look around and picked up her case and opened the door and stepped outside and into a car where her sister was waiting to drive to the sea, which they'd always wanted to see. And the house gave a sigh and slumped on its stones, which caused a slight lean in its beams and its bones, so the door swung open to let in the breeze. Oop. Oh, I don't know if I can go back. And welcomed the rain that rotted the floor, where a sapling grew right next to the stove, where the wallpaper peeled like onion skins and drifted about with the falling leaves, and the button that was once a shell in the sea by the parlor organ that rattled with nuts put there by a squirrel with rather a fuss, which startled the swallows that fed on the moths that fluttered and flew all over the house. There was even a bear in the basement one year who slept there all winter until the spring, which was when I came and cut a path through prickly burdock and nettles and grass and found what remained of the old farmhouse, where I filled my arms with wallpaper scraps and rain-soaked books and brittle maps and mud-caked dresses and handkerchiefs and a button that was once a shell in the sea. And back at my desk, I spread them all out and cherished my gifts from the falling down house. Then I sharpened my pencil and mixed some paint and dipped my brush and cut some shapes and began to imagine the things that took place in the home where 12 children were born and raised, where they ate and slept and worked and played and laughed and loved and grew quite old, where they'll live on now in this book that you hold, like your stories will, so long as they're told. Thank you. I am conscious that we lost some time with the technology, so I'm going to race through. But just to show you that some of the dresses that were found in the house, all hand sewn, that I used some of these fabrics in the collage materials. There were letters and school books and newspapers from the 1920s. I was very influenced by other artists who have come before me who did these kinds of cutaway drawings. Sometimes I realized I was staring at them for so long that they worked their way into my drawings, like this black cat in this painting was clearly what I had in mind, although I didn't realize it until later. I looked at Depression-era photographs from the United States where families made do with what they had. They repaired everything, and all of those things influenced the drawings that I made. I also, without wanting to rewrite history, wanted to make a nod to the gender distinctions that happened at the time, where girls would usually do the housework and boys were allowed to go off and get an education. So in this case, the older boy is taking care of a child and the older sister has a book tucked in her pocket, which are the little subversive ways that I try to show modern children that anything is possible. The cutaway was made as one giant piece of art in the house on the floor. I knew from the beginning that I wanted this story to take place over time and that every page of the book is joined up to the next page. So that thing about page turns, you can actually follow the foot or the ceiling or the floorboards onto the next page. I couldn't begin work on a blank piece of paper, not after dealing with this house with all these layers of story and history and memory and time. So I began with a big piece of paper and started sticking scraps of paper onto it, things that I had found in the house. And I built up these layers and I drew the house plan bit by bit and painted on the stairs. And then I found out all about the children and how old they were and what happened to them. And here's a photograph of the real family and their children taken outside the real farmhouse. And some of these dresses you can trace to the ones that I had hanging in the tree. I found out all their names and ages. I made wallpaper out of potato prints, but the scale was so big that the house would have had to have been bigger than this entire stage, and it was already enormous. So I made a stenciled wallpaper instead. You will see the little kid down here is having his own way with the wallpaper, with his hands dipped in paint. When it came time to show the house becoming taken over by nature, when it began to disintegrate, I had a choice to try and remake this art with all of the continuity details or to destroy the original art. And so I took a deep breath and destroyed the original art. And it was so much fun. I used the fabric, as I said, from the dresses to make little details. Everything else was painted and cut out and arranged. And this is a film which probably won't play. Oh, what do you know? Magic. Which just shows the building of putting some of these pieces in place. This was my pandemic project, and I felt that I was living in this house. It was incredibly satisfying. It was like playing with paper dolls. I will skip along so you get the idea. The curtains were made out of the real curtains in the house. I had fun putting all the children into bed. And I actually painted their entire bodies and all their clothes, and then painted their blankets and put them over the top and painted the pillows, even though you don't see any of that stuff underneath, because it made me think about how we don't see all the layers of history. We go into an old house and we have this sense of who might have walked there before us, who might have lived in this house, the conversations they might have had, and we don't really see them. So in my mind, this art is layers that won't be seen by most people, but I know they're under there. There's the naughty girl who painted the cat. The rolling hills were, of course, inspired by the hills around Milkwood and the original Virginia Lee Burton drawings that inspired me in the first place. I did a big mural while I was practicing the landscape. This is at Milkwood. I picked flowers. I looked at clouds. This was the original pump organ that was in the house, and again, this has music with it of my cousin playing what was left in that wheezy old organ, which is a kind of heartbreaking sound, but you'll have to imagine it. And then this too has more heartbreaking, wheezy organ music that shows just how everything was put together, cutting out the pieces. It was my editor's idea to end it this way, with putting myself in the book, which originally I was quite uncomfortable about, but she said, this book has become more and more true as you have gone along, and so it seems that you should end it with this story. One of the most wonderful things about doing this book, and indeed any book, is sharing it with children and then seeing what they do in response. This was a pre-K student in Singapore. This was their farmhouse, which I love so much. There was a school in Texas, and they did a collaborative class-wide project where they built their own farmhouse out of shoeboxes. There was a school in Vermont, and it was a school-wide project where they all looked at this photograph and then they reconstructed it themselves in community groups across the school of all different ages, and they all drew what they want to be when they grew up. And this one just about killed me. This is a kid called Wyatt, and his mum sent me this, that he loved the book Farmhouse. And on his last day of pre-K, he had to say what he wanted to do when he grew up, and he says, an explorer of falling down houses. The falling down house was not salvageable. And so one day a bulldozer came, and you have to imagine very dramatic music. And when I'm showing this to kids, I say, they get very sad, and they say, can I come and see this farmhouse? And I have to say, no, it came down. But I said, but do you want to see the bulldozer come and crunch it up? And of course they do, because who wouldn't want to see a bulldozer come and crunch up a house? And so this is the bulldozer crunching up the house. Very dramatic music. Here it goes. It's going to pull it, and then it comes down. And you have to imagine an auditorium of 1,000 children screaming. And now, where those trees are, where the farmhouse once stood, we have hung a hammock. And people come to Milkwood and lie in this hammock and dream about their own stories, which feels like a lovely and fitting end. And we also salvaged the front door of the farmhouse, the front door through which all of the 12 children came and went and grew up. and we put it as the front door at Milkwood, which is now where people come and go, authors and illustrators. And wait, that 15 minutes, it was 15 minutes ago. It's still 15 minutes. This is amazing. Wow, I could be here forever. This is Groundhog Day. This was our first group of authors and illustrators who came when we were trying to figure out if Milkwood would work. And here are some of their books. I'm sure you know them. And one of the great joys now have been all of the stories that have begun to be written at Milkwood and beyond, and people send us their books and bring the books that they've worked on before they came, and it feels like a wonderful community of writers and illustrators and editors and librarians and educators and readers. You can find out more about Milkwood at milkwoodfarm.org. And I have time for questions, which is amazing. Thank you all so much. If indeed there are any questions.
So I'm really curious. The family that lived there, have they come back? All the descendants, there must be a ton after 12 kids.
There are a ton, and they live in the valley. And I was a little worried, maybe. How will they feel about this? And I had talked at length with the youngest son of the youngest son, who is now in his 80s. And he was the one who gave me the photograph and all the stories, and he was delighted. He lives just down the road. But bit by bit, all of these other descendants from the family have come by, and they're all thrilled, which is so lovely. It's been a really, really nice element of it. But also, it feels universal in that way that almost everyone has some connection with an old house. I spoke to a librarian who was in tears. He said reading this book reminded him, he's a librarian in an elementary school where he went as a kid and where his father taught when he was a child, and where his own kids now go, and this school is being torn down. It's old. They've built a new one nearby, and that's going to be better for everybody, but he can't help feeling the loss of everything that was in those walls, which is what it's all about. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you, Sophie. That was beautiful. Yes. I had a quick question. I mean, that this was born out of such a beautiful, true story. And yet, the way we layer fact and fiction in the telling of our stories. So, where does one start and the other begin? I mean, when you take certain liberties with people's stories, and how did you go about that?
Yes, I mean, we could talk about that all day, right? We was talking to a friend who is a writer for books for grown-ups, Laurie Siegel. She is 97, and she writes a lot about her own experience and friends, and sometimes it's not always, flattering. And I said, how do you deal with that? And she said, I am not proud of what I have done, but I would do it again, which is kind of fascinating. And she was talking about one thing in particular. But I feel like I took several liberties, but I was not at any time trying to say, this is the story of this family. I did use the house as it was, falling down, and the contents as a springboard to a story about a family in time, which could be any family, and it could be anywhere in the world. It happened to be in this particular house, in this particular landscape, but it is more about the passing of time and the connections and the stories and the layers and the memories that we hold and the things we leave behind and the value we place on things, and then what do we do with that stuff? And I'm a terrible collector. I collect other people's stories all the time. I find scrapbooks, and I can't bear that they will go in the recycling because this is somebody's life, or drawings, or all of these things. It's a little bit of a problem. It's kind of why we built a barn to house all of these things. But yes, it's all the things that I'm interested about. Yeah.
Hi.
Hello.
So This book and Finding Winnie both seem to be books that would be great for social studies curricula, for history teaching. Do you find that there's a difference in your school visits talking to teachers who are interested in them for their history content and teachers who maybe are interested in literacy and whatnot?
Thank you. I am always amazed and inspired by how teachers use books in the classroom. I love it when a middle school teacher or a high school teacher will say, I use picture books in my classroom for all of these reasons. Thank you, this is fantastic. I don't care whose books they are. And the ways that teachers can tie things to their curriculum is, that's a special skill. I think I make a book and then I will see that they do a math project out of it, and I'm like, how did I? Okay. As storytellers, right? Anything, I learn something and retain something so much more efficiently if there's a story attached to it, even if. Was it Tao? I'm making you look at me now, Tao. No, it was Ashley. Well, one of you. We were talking about remembering people's names. And so, we tell ourselves stories, any mnemonic device, but storytelling is the best way to learn things, I think, whatever subject you're in. Yes. Hello.
This is a kind of personal question, but who is your best friend at Milkweed?
Who's my best friend at Milkwood?
Yes.
I would have to say Ed. He's right there. How could I not say Ed is my best friend at Milkwood? What is really good fun is if you're a grown-up and you can decide what you want to do, and so you can make a place where people come, and if you cook for them and if you make them cake, that helps a lot. But then you can invite people you admire and people whose books you love, and you may not know them, but if you promise them cake, they might come, and then you get to make all these new friends. So it's been a wonderful thing.
I'm just curious if there are a lot of your own lived experiences, memories that find, or your own stories that find space in the book.
Yes, I think we always put ourselves into our work, right? Even if maybe we don't realize it at the time, and later on we step back and go, oh yes, I am all of those characters. My brother and I, when we grew up in Australia, there was an empty, vacant block of land next to us with an old trailer on it, an old caravan, and an old man had lived there and was no longer, but he'd left the caravan behind with all of his stuff in it, and we played in there every day, and we had no morbid thoughts. We were just, this is our playhouse. We tried on his clothes. We opened the cans of food that were decades old in the cupboards. We pretended to make foul stews with, indecipherable canned goods. It was the best fun in the world. I feel sad as a grown-up that this man passed away and that his stuff remained. But I think that is, as a child, where I began to love the things that are left behind and find the stories in them. I always loved old things as a kid, and my brother wanted new things. He wanted new clothes and new toys, and I loved old things that were maybe a little broken, that had been mended, that had this evidence of other people's stories in them. And yeah, we are so formed as children, and then we just keep calcifying and building on those original things, which is so interesting.
Hi, Sophie. I have a question. I'm right here.
Oh, there you are.
Yeah. Which is your favorite picture book? One that you've done and one that somebody else might have done?
I reread Roxa Boxen recently. Do you know this book? It's illustrated by Barbara Cooney, and someone else's. I have a sad middle-aged brain that makes me forget names when I'm on the spot. Someone else will remember the author, but Barbara Cooney was the illustrator. And I had not read this for decades. And Alice McLaren, thank you, Suji. It is such a wonderful book. And I realized how heavily I have borrowed from that book over the years without even realizing it. And I talked with fourth graders today about what my own favorite book is, and as one of them said, is it like, choosing your favorite child? And of course it is. And one answer is always the one I'm working on now that, is the puzzle to be solved. And another is the ones that I had a retrospective of all of my books and the art from them in Texas at the National Center for Children's Illustrated Literature, and I walked around the room and it felt like walking around my life in the way that, I don't know if any of you, when you're working on something, drawing or writing or doing something with your hands, and maybe you're listening to an audiobook, and then those things forever become connected. And so for me, what I was doing at any time in my life, I walk through these books and I see my children at different ages, or I see coming from Australia to New York, and different things that happened are all embedded even in these books. And so that was a long-winded way of saying, I feel very connected to all of them. Yeah.
Just wanted to say that Roxabuxon is by Alice McLaren.
Yes.
And Tulika published her The Mountain That Loved a Bird in 9 languages.
Ah, see, I knew I liked you. That's fantastic. Thank you. I love a crowdsourcing of information. I think we are done. Yes. Thank you all so much.